Alright, so before we start, I just want to say that this isn't a comprehensive dive into dopamine. This is my interpretation of recent scientific findings and how it relates to gaming. And I'm mainly talking about this so I have a launchpad for future videos. Alright, so what is dopamine? Dopamine is a molecule in the brain and body that functions as a neurotransmitter. When secreted by neurons in the brain, dopamine sends signals to other neurons in the nervous system, which in turn send signals to the rest of the body to get ready and get focused. This molecule is primarily linked to motivation, not pleasure. Its function is to tell the brain to mobilize other parts of the body to begin seeking things outside of the body, whether it be food, water, leisure, and so on. Dopamine is linked to craving, the want or desire of something or outcome, and for drive, actually going out and acting on that desire to achieve that goal. Okay, this is going to sound obvious, but I'm going to cover it anyways. Why do we even have dopamine? Well, chemicals and electricity are the currency that our bodies operate on. Everything going on inside of our bodies are chemical and or electrical. This is just how being an organism in this world works. Happiness, satiety, getting up in the morning, it's all chemical and electrical inside. So dopamine is simply the system that allows our bodies to go do stuff within the rules of this world. It's also important to establish that everyone has a minimum, finite amount of dopamine in their body that's needed for you to function as a human. It won't be gone forever when it's depleted, but after a big amount of dopamine has been deployed in your system, the available dopamine you have needs time to replenish. Think of it like having gas in your car. When the tank has gas in it, you can go places. When it's empty, you can't go anywhere until it's filled up again. It's also important to note that the baseline amount of dopamine varies person to person. Some people may have a lot, others not as much. So there is also a genetic component at play here. Alright, so how does dopamine work really? When does dopamine deploy in the body? Dopamine deploys in response to wanting something and taking action toward getting that thing. It primarily increases in the face of a challenge or adversity, especially if the end goal is within your grasp. This is so you have the motivation to actually push through and overcome the challenge. This goes back to the caveman days of mankind. If you had low or no dopamine in the brain or body as a hunter-gatherer, you wouldn't get up and go out of your cave to find food, and you wouldn't chase after the food when it runs away. Which means you go hungry and die. That being said, humans aren't cavemen now. While dopamine still retains its original function, it's also used and abused for all sorts of means, and games are no exception to this. The simplest way games leverage our dopamine is that games are fun. That's it. If something is enjoyable, it leaves a positive memory, response, experience, or whatever in your mind and body, and thus you'll be more motivated to do that thing again. And I say that the vast majority of games out there are fun. Another big way games leverage our dopamine is through challenge. Every game has some form of challenge or adversity. It's likely because of this primal mechanic of the hunter-gatherer and dopamine's role in it that we as humans need some kind of challenge to make anything worth doing. This is likely why games of any sort have some challenge for the player to overcome, because without this, the game isn't engaging and thus isn't fun. When things are too easy, there's no need for the body to deploy dopamine. And so, even though it's easy, we may not be motivated to actually go do it. Challenge dopamine can be derived from anything from picking berries in a survival craft game, to a boss fight in an action RPG, to the competition that comes from a PvP shooter. Competition is an especially effective way to leverage dopamine, as competing for resources is also grounded in our human biology. When dopamine is toggled on, it drives you toward a goal. When you surpass the challenge, when you achieve the goal, your system gets a little hit of dopamine before tapering off, to reinforce that this endeavor was worth doing, was worth the effort, and you would do it again. It's like eating a small dessert after a big meal. However, should you fail, dopamine doesn't go away. In fact, it kicks in even more. This makes sense. If you were a caveman hunting for food and the food ran away, you wouldn't just quit right there. You chase after it. And if you catch it, your body wants to tell you that this pursuit was worth it, so you do it again, and so you stay alive. Failure itself is a part of the challenge and resistance that causes dopamine to deploy. It's dying to a boss who's at low health and thinking, one more try, I almost had it. It's losing a match by a few points and requeuing because, next one, I got this. Failure, mainly when it's close, is the mechanism that keeps you trying. This is an important caveat to mention. If whatever you're doing isn't at least a little bit feasible when you face the challenge, you won't see it as worth it and just give up. Pursuing it would be a waste of energy and resources. The failure aspect of dopamine goes back to not quitting. It's the chemical of motivation. It's there to make you not quit. So every little failure may seem like a setback, but to this molecule in your body, it's actually fuel to keep you trying. Anticipating a reward or outcome is the primary and initial releaser of dopamine. In gaming, it comes from the anticipation of gaining something like a cool item or an in-game currency, or something like winning that match of COD, defeating the boss in Dark Souls, or completing an achievement. It can even be something as simple as enjoying the game. That's rewarding enough. This is kind of the reason we set out to do stuff in the first place, to achieve or accomplish something. So it makes sense that dopamine would take effect when setting the goal, wanting the thing, as well as pursuing it. It's important to note, however, that chasing something solely for the reward is actually detrimental to your dopamine levels and your enjoyment of the activity. This is because, when you only focus on the reward, you link your enjoyment to obtaining the reward, which is the last 1% of the process, and not the activity, which is the greater 99% of the process. By doing this, you basically make the activity a chore, something you have to slog through till you get the good stuff, but that's where most of your time will be spent. By the time you get the reward, you'll be so frustrated that the high of getting the thing doesn't hit you. So as nice as it is to set a goal and work towards it, it's best practice to try and attribute reward and enjoyment to the activity itself, and not the end goal. So this next point is kind of an amalgamation of all the previous ones. This is one of the more devious ways when dopamine kicks in. For everything I've said, you would think that the pathway for dopamine and motivation is pretty straightforward. You always have a baseline amount of dopamine to function and do stuff. When you want something, dopamine increases, causing you to take action, causing dopamine to stay up. When you achieve the outcome you want, dopamine tapers off. If you don't achieve the thing, dopamine stays up until you do, or until it runs out and you get tired and fed up and quit. But actually, this isn't always the case. See, deployment of dopamine is most respondent to intermittent reward reinforcement. In other words, the almost randomized giving of the desired thing. I say almost because the game or activity will give it to you, just inconsistently. Your brain is a prediction-making machine, and it typically likes to be correct. We just discussed that dopamine is released in anticipation of a desired outcome. And we discussed that dopamine is released when working towards an outcome, but there is resistance or failure. So intermittent rewards really is a double whammy of dopamine. You know the outcome and you know it's possible, but you just don't know when. So all you can do is keep trying until you get it or quit. Back to the caveman example, not every hunt or every forage will be successful, but some are. Really, your brain weighs the options of going out and maybe finding food versus starving to death and chooses the former, as there is at least a chance of a positive outcome with this option. This is how casinos and slot machines keep you hooked, because they really will pay out at some point, but you don't know when. Likewise, every time you matchmake for a game, you don't know whether you'll win or lose, whether you'll have fun or not, but you know it's possible. It could happen. So you keep trying. As I mentioned earlier, you get a little uptick in dopamine level after accomplishing a goal before it tapers off. That hit of dopamine you get after accomplishing something, that reinforces effort. Completing challenges and ticking boxes in video games likely leverages dopamine for that reason. If every action has a reward with it, you're more likely to do those actions. This could also explain why most quote-unquote challenges in games today are brain dead easy. They might be trying to bring up your dopamine, even by a little bit, in order to get you motivated to further play the game. Like, it's kind of weird that games reward you for literally opening the game with a login bonus, when that's something I'm going to do no matter what. Novelty is also a big driver of dopamine. New things are interesting, they're exciting, and our brains want to explore and understand it. I'm sure everyone watching, especially in today's gaming landscape, has played the new event for a game. It was fun and it got you back into it. Then, your excitement for the game slowly tapered off until you get a little bored with it. But then a new event or season drops and suddenly you're engaged again. Even with new title releases, you see the trailer, the hype builds, and you're encouraged to buy it. No one's immune to it. New stuff is just stimulating. I also must note that the science says that games with frequent update cycles for new content tend to increase dopamine above baseline by a lot. like as much as cocaine would. So, you know, try not to hype new things too much for yourself. Alright, so why is dopamine important as a gamer? Well, as a kid and teen, I'd wake up and want to play a game because it's fun, and I was excited to do so. But more recently as an adult, I found myself waking up and wanting to play certain games I didn't really enjoy, but with an intense craving. At the start of the year, I got back into Apex Legends, playing exclusively the mixtape modes, because I wanted some PvP shooter energy, and I found it really fun. But a month in, I found myself logging on without really wanting to play the game. I soon realized, however, that I was just playing to complete the Battle Pass challenges. This molecule in our body is a big driver as to why we do stuff. Like everything, it can be used for good or evil. And in the current gaming landscape, it seems like many companies are trying to leverage this for their own selfish gain. Not just in gaming, but everywhere. And I know that this isn't new news, it's been happening for a while now. Do game developers factor in dopamine into the games they make? I don't know. I can't say for certain, as it's likely a case-by-case thing. For my time in college for game design, I'm inclined to believe no, as game design isn't taught as a subset of psychology. Although, I'm pretty certain that the big AAA studios are aware of dopamine's role in keeping players hooked. What is certain is that the effects are very real. That there are elements of games we play and the things we use that are designed to make us keep using them, even without our conscious awareness. So it's up to us as consumers to identify the things that are out to manipulate us and play responsibly. I want to end off with something I didn't mention earlier in the video. That is, how to know when our dopamine is active and how to deal with it. This part is just going to be based off my personal experience and observations, as there's no scientific findings that I know of at least, that discuss what to do when in the midst of dopamine being active in our system. So how do we know when dopamine is activated inside of us? Well, I believe engagement, focus, and especially frustration are all signs that dopamine is currently above baseline within our bodies. You know, when you're feeling a little stressed and nervous inside, when you're starting to sweat a little bit, when you think you should quit, but you can't for some reason. This is when I think dopamine is really working through your system. When I feel frustrated internally, I know dopamine is working hard because I can't stop trying the challenge that makes me frustrated. So when I feel activated or frustrated, I try to set some kind of time limit or condition, like, I will try to kill this boss 5 more times and I will stop playing regardless of the outcome. Also, if you find that your ability to play or attempts get worse as you go on, then the point where it's at its lowest, either you or the game, is probably when you should quit. Something like you enter a boss room and die on the first move, or you enter a match and your team is losing by a lot and it feels like you can't aim for some reason. These are all real examples of when I think it's time to call it quits. These are the times when I try to, at least. Likewise, if you feel physically tired or very understimulated, then that's probably a good time to do something else. All that being said, periods of focus typically last about 90 minutes, and I've found that after an hour and a half to 3 hours of doing something, I lose motivation and I want to do something else. So getting hooked on something for a whole day likely won't happen. You can just let dopamine in your system rise and fall naturally. But if you know a certain game or activity is going to suck you in for a while, it would be wise to not do it unless you know you have the time to see it through till when motivation fades. Also, I want to add that being in an activated state of dopamine isn't necessarily a bad thing. I think that there's a fine line between engagement and frustration, so it's up to each of us to find where that line is. For dealing with novelty dopamine, this one's kinda hard, curbing your enthusiasm for new things. I don't have a big fix for this, but what I've been doing for a while now is to not gorge myself on content for new games and updates. I might watch the official trailer, but that's really it. I think the goal here is to not go past the level of pleasant anticipation for something by limiting your exposure to it. And by doing that, you also don't spoil the surprise and novelty of the new thing. Also, I don't think it's always you or your dopamine levels to blame for your game performance and enjoyment. Maybe this low-level dopamine state impacts our perception, but sometimes it really does feel like the game itself is telling you to stop playing. Alright, that's all for this video. I hope this gives you some insight into gaming and your motivation. I'll leave links to some of the source material I used in case you want to learn more about dopamine. Remember to have fun out there, play responsibly, and stay gaming. See ya.